Good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to the second event in the series of our OeNB talks on international and climate economics. It's a great pleasure to have you here at the Österreichische Nationalbank. Today's topic is sustainable security, balancing risks and resources in Europe's climate and defense transition. And I want to take the opportunity to, of course, first of all, welcome the speakers of this afternoon. And we have 4 speakers, and I will introduce them very quickly a bit later. And I want to thank the speakers for their willingness to speak today. Of course, also a very warm welcome to Andreas Breitenfeldner, who is the moderator, the master of ceremony today, actually, and he will introduce the speakers later on. And a warm welcome to everybody, especially, of course, to Ewald Nowotny, the former governor of the Austrian Central Bank, the OeNB. Let me just use the opportunity to say very few words on the topic. And I think today, at the time when there is the World Economic Forum in Davos and important speeches, actually 2 important speeches today. The Austrian president has had a speech in front of the diplomatic corps, but Donald Trump also has had a speech until recently at the World Economic Forum. It shows us that the global security situation has changed actually quite dramatically. And some of us are still rubbing our eyes a bit in disbelief. There is a famous quote by Colin Powell, the former defense secretary of the US, at the end of the Cold War, who said, "We are running out of enemies." This is the quote by Colin Powell. But now some may say, it seems we in Europe are running out of friends, actually. And this is a change of priorities and a shift of priorities, a shift of the paradigm that is actually quite substantial. From an economic perspective, there's, of course, even more. From an economic perspective, we have been profiting from a peace dividend over at least 30 years, probably even more, since the fall of the Iron Curtain. This peace dividend allowed, of course, the public spending to actually do more in terms of social benefits, to provide additional funds for investments into fighting climate change and reaching the SDGs. And this already tells you about the trade-offs we are facing and the trade-offs we are going to discuss today at a time where, of course, defense spending becomes more important. And we are probably going back to a situation that is the normal situation we had for a long time, where there was not such a peace dividend, but the spending for defense, for security has been much higher than it had been the last 3 centuries since the beginning of the 1990s, actually. Amid escalating climate risks and geopolitical tensions, European governments and financial institutions face a critical dilemma. How can we reconcile those ambitious climate goals on the one hand with the pressing security needs and the pressing needs to invest in security to the other hand? There are many issues that will be important, and some of them will be dealt with today in the panel. First of all, could sustainable finance extend to defense to a certain extent, or would that amount to what has been sometimes called olive greenwashing, alluding to the pattern that we see in military garment, actually? How can we ensure energy security, value chains, and access to critical materials in an era of climate-driven instability? How can we foster cooperative climate action in a divided world? The idea of climate clubs, for instance. And more broadly, does the climate crisis fuel conflicts? And is there a feedback loop between conflict and climate problems? And ultimately, is climate policy even perhaps a peace policy? We are very happy, and that's the time to talk a bit about the 4 speakers very quickly, to have 4 experts that can talk to both aspects, to the aspect of climate and climate policy, but also the aspect of security and security policy. We have Walter Feichtinger, the president of the Center for Strategic Analysis, located in Austria, on the podium. We have Florian Krampe from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, who is joining us very soon because he had a delayed flight. We have online two speakers from Milano and Brussels, Silvia Merla, the head of the ESG and policy research at Algebris Investments, and Guntram Wolf, well-known professor at University Libre de Brussels and former director of Bruegel. We're very happy to have you all, and this gives me the opportunity actually, because two speakers will be online and they're listening to us, to welcome everybody that listens to us, many attendees over the internet on our online stream actually. Today is a follow-up, as part of a follow-up series of discussions on economics of the energy transition. There was, I think, more than 10, 15 events on climate aspects in context with energy transition. And we're talking about, as I said, climate and security today. And you might ask yourselves, why are we doing that at the Austrian National Bank, at the Austrian Central Bank? And it's clear that our first concern is price stability. That's part of our DNA. That's our main mandate, our core mandate. But of course, there is lots of interactions between the development of prices, financial market stabilities, and aspects that we're discussing today, such as security aspects and aspects in the context of climate change, climate policy, investments, of course, spending restrictions, and so on and so on. That's the reason why also the ECB, the European Central Bank, is very interested in these kind of topics. They affect inflation expectations, they affect inflation projections, they affect, of course, structural aspects that might later on be reflected in the price levels and in the price developments. And in that context, I think it's very, very natural that central banks are also interested in these questions and try to advance research, but also, of course, the application of research to policy and policy making. A big thank you goes to the event team for the excellent preparation of the event, as always. Thanks a lot. And I hope you feel welcome here at the OeNB. And this ends already my very short introductory remarks. And I want to hand over to Andreas for the moderation, and wish you all an insightful afternoon with lots of interesting ideas, lots of interesting discussions, and hopefully leaving the OeNB with more information and with having the impression of an interesting afternoon. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Governor, for this already very insightful introduction to our topic. Let me first introduce the one person that is indeed here with us already, Walter Feichtinger. First, he's the head, as already been said, by head of the Center of Strategic Analysis in Vienna, which is an independent platform for security policy issues. Previously, he headed the Institute for Peacemaking and Conflict Management at the National Defense Academy in Vienna, the Militärakademie. He's political scientist, a military and security expert, and a former Austrian brigadier in the Austrian Bundesheer. By the way, perhaps you have seen him yesterday in the TV when he was presenting the results of the so-called Wehrdienstkommission. I think that was the right name. Yeah. So his key statement, he chose actually, is no doubt climate change has a strong impact on security issues. It should be considered as a threat multiplier having many different manifestations. So the second speaker is Florian Krampe, already on the way to us. He is the director of the Climate Change and Risk area of SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace and Research Institute. The SIPRI, as you might know, is very famous because they, year by year, they deliver all the expenditure in terms of US dollars that various countries, all countries, are spending on on defense. So it's a very important source of information. He joined CIPRI and held research as advisory positions quite a long time ago, focusing on peace building, environmental security, and international conflict. He's a political scientist as well, specializing in climate security, defense, and all the issues we are talking about. His key statement: a key 21st century defense strategy cannot be built on the assumptions of a 20th century world. Ignoring climate change means we are not building security, we are creating stranded assets. We are building a fortress on quicksand and we end up being less secure. Silvia Merla, and she is with us, but you won't see her because she is only online. Silvia is the head of ESG policy research at Algebris Investment, already mentioned. Previously, she worked with, by the way, also with the European Commission, the DG ECFIN. That's actually where I know her personally. But also at Bruegel, already mentioned, quite for a couple of years, and she's still basically also working there. She's an economist with expertise on sustainable finance, fiscal policy, and ESG frameworks in Europe. Her key statement: I've chosen this, I have to say, and she might be unhappy about this choice. A move towards sustainable defense investing will challenge traditional sustainable investment approaches that exclude companies based on their share of revenues they derive from defense. So actually, this means the topic of today, sustainable security, comes very much to that issues she's talking about. Guntram Wolf is, as already mentioned, professor at the for economics at University Libre de Bruxelles. Previously served as the director of Bruegel for quite a while, don't know, even decades almost. The European policy think tank. It's actually the think tank of all European countries, yeah. So even Austria is contributing to this think tank. So it's our think tank in a sense. And he is an economist specializing, of course, on European integration, macroeconomic policy, and geopolitical issues. I also chose one statement. He might disagree with the in the sense that he might think there are other issues that are more important. Perhaps my choice was not the best one. With the US now retreating from its role of European guardian, greater cooperation is essential to close technological gaps and reduce rearmament costs. Yeah, myself, I'm here for already years with the Austrian Central Bank. I've also used to work with the OECD, or better to say with the OECD, the representation of Austria at the OECD, and with DG ECFIN, as already mentioned. I'm specifically dealing with climate and green finance issues for quite a while. I have also a statement on which, of course, might not be that thing, but maybe helpful. Investing in climate or defense involves difficult trade-offs, but there are also synergies, e.g. with regard to energy security. So I think we have now a lot of input to thought, and it's now the best for you, Mr. Feichtinger, to give your presentation. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to talk to you. I will not talk about the Austrian conscript system and the Austrian military. A lot was said already by the experts. Now we hand it over to the politicians, and it is on the way, I think, from my understanding. What I want to do is to highlight the nexus between climate change and security. And I identified 7 examples that give a good impression of that, why it is important to have it in mind, and what can we expect in the foreseeable future in this context. The first one Have you ever heard about the climate war in Darfur, in the western part of Sudan? Since 2003, the international experts are talking about that topic, and I think from my understanding it is totally exaggerated to call it a climate war. But the climate change and the impact of that had a huge impact on the fighting between different fractions here in Darfur. Of course, it was a contest between the center and the periphery, different fractions in place, etc., etc. But the widening of the desert of the Sahara brought many nomads to go to other areas where they have been before. So they came in conflict with settlers. And that was fueling the conflict that was already in place, and it was a huge matter in this regard, and it is ongoing because the desertification has not stopped. It will go on. So climate war, to say, is exaggerated, but the climate change had a huge impact in the conflict that was in place and that is still in place. The second case maybe you know about the dams in Iran and the water scarcity. We can read it in the media for many years already. So the picture here shows that water is real, is like a diamond in Iran already, because the shortages of water is having a strong impact on the society and the political system itself. If you have 19 dams, huge dams, and they are filled up to only 35% in October last year, you can imagine that will cause a problem. And in Tehran, you have a serious problem by providing water. But what is the key task for a government? To provide food and water and security to the population. So if you have already a political conflict in a land, in a country, and that comes in addition, so it fuels and it increases the problem, the political problem you have already. So water scarcity is really a big challenge. The second point is, have you ever heard about the big dam in Ethiopia? Sudan is in fear of getting not enough water. So if you are the second or the third in line of a dam, you always have a problem. We see it in Euphrates, in Turkey and in Syria, and we see it in extreme here in Sudan and Ethiopia. So the political tensions are increasing if the water is going less. And that is what we see and what we witness in this context. So dams and water scarcity and the control over water, who says who get what, how much, is a real challenge. The next. That is in every newspaper, in the news, etc., access to resources. So due to the climate change, many resources are in reach, so to speak. You can use them. You have to go it. You have to handle it. That's for sure. But they are not under a thick ice. What we see about Greenland is not primarily, what they say, an issue of security for the first. President Trump argues that the United States needs Greenland because of security reasons. That is not my understanding of the situation. I think it is more of economy and economic and access to resources, to rare earth, etc. in this regard. So the melting of the ice can increase political tensions if they want to get access to certain resources. The second example here in this regard is Venezuela. It's not so far away, only 2 weeks, 3 weeks, I would say, when we could see what does it mean to a country that is dependent on resources, that the whole income is from that resources, and if another one says, I will take it. So what does it do to the country? What does it do to the people and to the government? And what does it mean and what does it signal to other big players on the world when one says, I want it, I take it, I use it, and I control it? A very important point. What we see with rare earth in China is about oil in Venezuela from the American side. I can have a denial to other actors if I control it. I can say, you do not get it, or you have to pay more for it. So resources itself are a security tool. That is why we are talking about the securitization of economy in this regard. That is really in place. Next example. Did you book a journey to the Arctic in the foreseeable future? If you did so, don't be surprised when you have a submarine around you. That is new. And that is totally different to 20, 30 years before. Because the Arctic region in the 90s was seen as a desecuritized zone. Mr. Gorbachev said, security is not necessary there. We do not care about, we keep it, it's the economy, it's the ecology, but not security in the Arctic region. 25, 30 years later, it has changed to the total opposite. What we see is a strong securitization of that region. What is the reason for that? Because we have a passage, we have a passage now over the Arctic routes. 3 routes are there, and it is expected that in 2040, 50, about 10% of the shipping from China to United States and Europe also could go through that passage. If you have that, the military comes in place, because any route has to be secured by the military. We see it in the Strait of Malacca, we see it in the Strait of Taiwan, and now we see it in the Arctic. So don't be surprised, take your photos and say, okay, it's a new dimension, it's a new era we are living in. When we said in the 1990s it is a desecuritized zone, the United States, China not at all, and Russia did not invest in military means in that region. Over the last 10 years, Russia invested a lot in re-establishing their military sites in the region, in investing more in icebreakers and so on and so forth, in order to keep that under control. So the interest from the Chinese side, for example, is not to use the shore of Russia. It's better to go straight ahead over the middle route, and you do not be dependent on Russia, and you do not have to pay a lot to them. So geopolitical rivalry is a huge driver in that regard, and climate change is the fuel in that, because it brings new opportunities and options. Floods, rising sea level, and fences. Can you imagine where it is? Where is that fence built? Yeah, not too close, I would say. India, Bangladesh. It's longer than 3,000 kilometers. What is the reason for? Because India is afraid of being invaded by so-called extremist groups from Bangladesh, but in reality it is more than that. Because of the rising sea level, many people will be displaced in Bangladesh, and India is expecting a strong pressure against their country, bringing millions of people at a very short time and to be too strong to handle by the government. So the fence is in place, it is built already since many years, and it is going on and is going forth. The Gulf of Bengal is one of the regions worldwide that will be affected most by rising sea level. Worldwide, about 250 million people will lose their homes, according to rising sea level. They have to go. So what does it mean? They come in conflict with other peoples because they need a new homeland. They need a new place to live and to stay. So migration will be affected, and local and regional conflicts will also be fueled by that. Now we go to Egypt. Egypt has an increasing population. 10 years ago, it was about 90 million. Today, it is about 150 million. And in 2050, it will be about 167 million, according to UN estimates. So what does it mean to the country? They need more food. They need more water. They need more jobs. They need more stability. In opposite to that development, we see that a rising sea level will bring the loss of arable land in Egypt. What you see here is that approximately 10% of the arable land will get lost in the next 20 years, 20, 30 years. So what does it mean to a country that has a rapidly increasing population, but the loss of arable land? And that is the most important land in Egypt for feeding the country. It will bring tensions, it will bring problems, and it will bring migration. That is one of the points that is of highest interest to Europe, again. So the rising sea level is really causing a lot of developments that have a strong security linkage. Food, scarcity and priceless accelerators. Do you remember 2011? The so-called Arab Spring? What happened? Here you see protests in Tunisia. A young man protested loudly and publicly again because of the bread price. He said, I cannot afford it. I will die. I cannot buy the food I need to survive. It was not the only aspect, but the problem behind was that droughts in the years before, in the mismanagement of the government, led to a situation where the people really couldn't afford the daily life. That was fueling political protests, and it led to the toppling of the government. And it was not only limited to Tunisia. It was also later on in Syria, it was in Egypt, and it is still in Libya. And the second example in that regard was Syria. In Syria, we had a similar problem. After some years of drought, the harvests were not as expected, and the government had a problem to feed all the people, the whole population. So if it comes to a bottleneck, what does the government do? It always gives the persons they prefer the goods that are needed. And many people are excluded of that. And that was also bringing increasing protests in Syria. It was only a contribution, a part of it, but it is a fuel for conflict and protests. So what can we say? There is a strong linkage between security and climate change, first. Second, we can expect that these problems will increase according to the effects of the climate change. Third, we, from the Western part, have to be aware of that, and we have to keep it in mind, and we have to include it in our assessments and in our programs, that these effects will be in place and they will increase. So no assessment of anything without having in mind and including all these aspects of climate change and related security issues and aspects. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Mr. Feichtinger, for taking us with you in this journey in your submarine through areas which indeed, which show that it's indeed a global issue. And even if, right now people are, for example, talking about the weather in Vienna, which is quite cold at the moment, and even so might not be that such a big issue, climate change. It's continuing, and it's continuing globally. And you very much opened, I think, very much well opened the debate. Guntram. Now the floor is yours. And I also found it interesting that you, as a military expert, spoke quite a lot about climate change. And we'll now hear Guntram, who actually I know much more as somebody who was accompanying the European Commission's Green Deal and issues like this quite substantially, but now concentrating on other issues. We'll see what it is about.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation. Do you hear me well? Yes. Okay. So it's a really great pleasure to be here with you today. Let me share my slides. Does this work?
Wonderful. Yes. Wonderful.
Yes. Wonderful. Okay, so what I will talk about today is indeed not climate change, but the effect of European procurement in the defense area and the interrelation between European defense procurement and the macroeconomy. So certainly a security topic. Now, that is not to say that I think climate topics are not relevant. Of course, climate topics are extremely relevant. I just think that at the moment, of course, a lot is happening on the security side. Our spending on security has been going up tremendously. And the question is, are we spending on the right things? That's a military question. But do we spend in a way that our security is enhanced as well as our economic performance is enhanced or not? And to sort of put that into a conceptual start with a sort of conceptual point. I think the first point really I want to make is that the security challenge will remain. It will not disappear. So let me try to make this full slideshow. I see that you see it only part. That's better, right? Yes. So the first point I want to make is this security challenge is not gonna disappear, right? And I think the way to understand this from a macroeconomic point of view is by looking at the size of various European economies as well as their military spending. And I think that the first point is here on the left. It basically compares the sizes of major economies, including Russia, and not measured in US dollars, but in purchasing power parities. Now, you all know that purchasing power parity is a concept that allows us to compare the size of economies based on what you can actually purchase with the economy, with the economic output and the economic income that you generate. So it's a better measure really to compare countries, especially countries that are with each other in conflict or perhaps in more or less direct confrontation. And so here the left chart shows you that contrary to what is often said, that Russia is a relatively small economy and that Europe should easily be able to manage the Russian threat to Europe, it is actually quite a big economy when measured in purchasing power parities. It's in fact bigger than Germany. Now, the second point I want to make here is that, of course, this concept of purchasing power parity also applies to the purchase of security, to the purchase of military services. And For that, there is a concept called military purchasing power parity, where you zoom in on and compare the prices of various military equipment and the production of military equipment, as well as the prices of military personnel. And what you see here on the right-hand side is that actually at military purchasing power parity, Russia's economy, Russia's spending on attack, not defense, is actually much bigger than the numbers suggest when you look at the numbers only measured in US dollars. And in fact, it's so big that it is comparable in size to the spending of Western Europe on defense, also measured in purchasing power parity. The chart also reveals, I think, one more important point, which is that Ukraine is actually quite massive. It's quite big. It's big, not so much measured in dollars, but measured in purchasing power parities. And that's why Ukraine, really from a macro point of view here, is absolutely central for the security of the European continent. That's just in terms of the macro and the military spending numbers. Now, of course, when we think about defense spending, I mean, this is really about security, right? It's not about growth policy. So I would argue, let's not oversell defense spending as a growth policy and as a macroeconomic policy, and let's certainly not forget about all the other areas that are relevant for growth policy. And I mean, I was struck by a recent chart that I saw on energy, the energy intensive industry, and how it has been losing. And of course, the big question, what else emerges? How do we manage the structural change that is ongoing in our economy due to energy price changes, but also due to the decline in cost of artificial intelligence? I mean, there's a major Schumpeterian reorganization of our economy ongoing, where Europe has to learn how to manage that kind of Schumpeterian reorganization. But defense is, in fact, one small, perhaps small part of the wider growth story, and I think it deserves to be looked at in more detail. And what I want to focus on is how defense spending can be an opportunity for growth. I mean, first, the numbers. Defense spending the growth has been massive. NATO Europe spent on military equipment around 60 billion in 2021. By 24, Germany alone ordered military equipment for almost 60 billion euros. And the numbers are going up to 80 billion, which is actually the combined spending of the UK, France, and Poland. So Germany is becoming the big guy here in spending. And there's a sort of substantial literature on how the spending has a short-term macroeconomic impact, and basically works through Keynesian multipliers. So that certainly is a short-term Keynesian support to the economy. But there is also a longer-term story, and that has been nicely shown in a recent paper by Antolin Diaz and Paulo Surico in the American Economic Review, where they look at 120 years of US government spending on defense, and they find that the effects are actually long-term, and they are long-term positive. And the reason why they are long-term positive is basically due to the strong channel coming through innovation and research and development, as well as the ability of the defense sector to then drive broader innovation in the domestic industry. So there is some evidence that this actually matters. Now, I do want to show you a bit about what we spend our resources on in defense, and then argue that we actually do need significant procurement reforms, not only from a security perspective. We need different types of equipment. We need to move differently on procuring, but more importantly, also to get the growth benefits of that defense spending into Europe and not elsewhere. Now, let's just look at the numbers. So with the Kiel Institute, I published, also at the Kiel Institute, I published a major tracker of defense procurement. It's called the Kiel Military Procurement Tracker, where we look at a couple of key European countries and all their military procurement based on open source data. We collect this database. It has more than 700 entries. And these are the numbers for Germany. And what you see here is that German military defense procurement actually took quite a time to pick up after the start of the war in 2022, the start of the full-scale invasion. But it really increased significantly only in late 23, and the numbers now in 24 and 25 have become really big. But it took 1.5 years for the numbers to go up. So I wouldn't expect any macroeconomic effect in these years. By 24, 25, there should be a short-term macroeconomic impact already. Now, the issue, however, is that when you look at the pattern of defense spending, you see that an increasing amount is actually going to the US defense industrial base. And while the overall spending on the US defense industrial base isn't that big compared to the overall spending, there is an issue here when it comes to on what do we spend in the US and on what do we spend in Europe. And with this paper, which is a recent paper, we looked at this from the perspective of the US. So we compiled all US foreign military sales notifications, and I mean, the paper discusses this instrument in detail, but basically all major military sales of the United States go through this instrument, foreign military sales. And all these foreign military sales have to be notified to Congress. And so basically we could access that data from the Pentagon website, scraping all that data. The data set is also available on the Bruegel website. And what you see here is, and really I want to focus on two things. I mean, the first thing is, of course, Europe has become a bigger customer in the last years, which is not surprising. But Europe has also really increased its dependency on the United States high-tech technological base, aircraft, air defense, command control, communication systems, software. And of course, that has security implications to the extent that you worry about the transatlantic relation. And I think there are reasons to worry about that relation. That dependency is a security dependency in the sense that software, for example, such as the one that will be built on the German frigates F-127, is a US software which the United States controls and is able to of course, use as a geopolitical instrument if relations were to deteriorate. And I'm not saying they're going to do it. I'm saying it's just a vulnerability that exists. But it is also a growth issue, right? And I want to talk a bit about the growth issue in a second. And basically, the growth issue is that. Of course, if the high tech is being bought from the United States, well, then you not only reinforce the technological leadership of the United States relative to the European defense industrial base, but you also make sure that the benefits of the R&D benefits, the research benefits, the innovation benefits will not accrue to the European economy, but will accrue to the US defense industrial base and then later on to the US economy. So I think there is a need here to think about how do we actually move on and encourage the purchase of technologies, high tech from European companies. Now, there is a specific aspect that I want to focus on in my last couple of minutes, which is about the innovation and defense technologies that have reshaped the battlefield dynamics in Ukraine. I mean, those are actually types of technologies that at the moment we do not see in the European procurement tracker. So basically, Germany, the UK, France, they don't buy the kind of stuff that we see is being used in the battlefield in Ukraine. I mean, the numbers are really, really clear on this. And, you know, I'm an economist, not a military analyst, but I do read what military institutions write. And for example, there is a defense review by the United Kingdom which actually urges for a significant reshifting of military strategies. So there is a military dimension to go towards some of these newer technologies, drone warfare, autonomous systems, AI-driven systems, and others. Now, this has economic implications, and we have to think about how do we incentivize and how do we think about getting these kind of companies into our procurement processes. That's important for security. It's important for growth. And there is actually a bit of a discussion ongoing in Brussels on this. There's a Commission, European Commission communication, which sort of calls for the unleashing of disruptive innovation for defense readiness. And there is a nice paper by Bureau Sudreau and others that shows that the number of firms in Europe that work on this sort of new tech, new defense firms, is actually quite substantial, and it is growing. However, these firms actually do have difficulties getting orders, as I see in my military procurement tracker, where basically they are not part of the main procurement that is ongoing. So how do we think about this? A bit of theory. I mean, the basic problem is essentially a transaction cost and information cost problem. Procurement agencies don't really know these companies, don't really know the products of these companies, and conversely, these companies find it actually quite difficult to access procurement agencies, and this is a transaction cost problem. It's also really an information asymmetry problem, and I think we need to think about how to solve these interconnected or connected problems. And yes, that's an issue. So I did look at the data. I think I mentioned it. I mean, the German Court of Auditors is complaining about some of the new defense tech still missing from European procurement. In our analysis, we found that in the Kiel military procurement tracker, we actually only find 2 startups among the defense contractors of the United Kingdom, Germany, and Poland. So a lot of this new tech startup ecosystem actually is not yet in. Okay. And we do show that, and that's a new chart. It's not yet published, so I'm just putting it up here very quickly. But what we show here is that actually the share of procurement going to the top 10 companies is very big in Europe, while in the United States it's actually much wider, and the SME system actually has seen a significant rise in the share of overall procurement. So companies like Anduril somehow managed to get into the US procurement stack. So how did they do this? Well, I think what we are working on now, and I don't have time to talk about this in detail, is looking at best practices of procurement reform to bring these kind of companies into the procurement stack. And the United States has done significant reforms, and some of them have been studied by leading economists and published in top journals, and so showing that these type of procurement reforms are successful in bringing in innovative new defense companies. And of course, there is a whole discussion on defense procurement in Ukraine that has massively shifted and really shifted the type of contracts and the type of relation with companies that are needed. Okay, so let me perhaps conclude that, of course, it's not all about small tech startups. It's also about the fragmentation of the European defense market, which is actually very substantial. And for that, we published a paper with my colleague at Bruegel and my successor, actually, Jeromin Zettelmeier and Armin Steinbach. We in this paper basically what we had, and we published that and presented it at the ECOFIN meeting in Warsaw in April last year. And what we drive at in this paper is basically to argue that, well, if you really want to sort of get the scale and the cost effectiveness into the defense markets, you have to think about how to integrate markets, increase competition, and ensure the scale that is necessary, that none of us, not even Germany, actually has if it were to only procure nationally. And so we are doing some proposals in that paper, but essentially the point is that the national bias in defense markets that at the moment is very big needs to be reduced, and we need to find ways of integrating these defense markets. Okay, so to conclude, defense is the one area where Europe actually does spend a lot. And so given that it spends a lot, I think it is absolutely critical to ensure that this maximizes not just security, but also the growth effects. In my view, there is a significant, and in my view, basically, this has become, I mean, the two goals have actually become quite aligned by now, given where we are in the transatlantic relations, and therefore I do think we need to think how to reform our procurement processes, military procurement processes in Europe. At the moment, they favor big established players, and they favor high-tech purchases from the United States. I think given that warfare is rapidly changing, we need to readjust. We need to readjust in terms of technology. We need to readjust in terms of US high-tech dependence. And we need to think about how to bring in the small and agile new companies with new tech into the procurement processes. Lastly, we cannot ignore, I think, the more longer-lasting issue of defense market fragmentation. The costs are simply too high. If we rely purely on national markets, then, I mean, basically, we don't have the scale that is necessary. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Guntram, for giving us an example of how many aspects are important to combine these two very broad topics, which is climate sustainability issues and defense security issues. And we already knew at the beginning that it is a almost impossible task to fully cover all of this. And indeed, we see it's really difficult even to get a meaningful debate here at the table where we really interact with each other. But this is the challenge for the discussion later on. We'll see. It's my challenge, of course. But Silvia will help us, I know, because she comes from the finance perspective. She knows a lot about these ESG areas of finance and tries indeed to combine defense issues with these ESG issues. We are very, very curious to hear what you have to say, Silvia.
Thank you. So first of all, thank you for the invitation, and thank you for reaching out after so many years when we were at the Commission together. Let me try first of all to share my screen as well. Okay, I think I have the same problem Guntram had. Okay, can you see my presentation?
Full screen.
Okay.
Yes.
So I was betting on Guntram doing the macro view, which I am glad to say that he did. He was right, because I wanted to instead give you a little bit more of a finance perspective on this issue. And as you were saying, this is potentially where those two parts of the story can probably come together, right? Because we know there's been, like, last year, big announcement from the European Commission about the Rearm Europe project with 800 billion to be spent, but ultimately only 150 in public money. So as all of us who are familiar with the way the big Commission announcement go, obviously there is always a implicit reliance on the private financial sector to sort of like leverage the more limited public funding that is pledged to the goal. And to be honest, when I saw that announcement earlier last year, I have to say, a little bit skeptical that the private sector would be jumping at this opportunity, as it seemed to be the view of Brussels. Because if we look at the European financial market context, when it comes to the investment in defense, There's been quite some skepticism around this sector that has been building up over the past, I would say, probably 10 years. And this has mostly been driven by reputational concerns. So if we look at the asset under management in the EU asset management industry, which is obviously a very key conduit for basically channeling savings, European savings, into investment, over the past 5 to 10 years, there's been an increasingly strong penetration of restrictions targeting investment in the defense sector specifically, which is what you can see on the chart on the right-hand side of this slide. And this is very, very different, obviously, in Europe compared to the US landscape. So in the US, restrictions on defense investments have been very marginal and they haven't really grown over the past years. In Europe, they have grown quite significantly. So as of 2021, which is the latest data I could find on this, but I'm pretty sure that if we were to extend to 2024, this would be higher. But 14% of all the retail asset under management in Europe was subject to some form of restrictions related to weapons or defense investment. And again, a trend that is not seen in the US. Also, obviously, this is in part explained by the fact that approach to sustainable finance on the two sides of the Atlantic has been very different, with Europe being at the forefront and the US following not very quickly, and especially now definitely lagging behind on this. So this is probably the reason why in the 2024 Draghi report, landmark Draghi report, there is a part of that report that argues that access to financing for EU defense companies was actually hindered not so much by lack of market opportunities, but from the way in which financial institutions were interpreting EU sustainable finance rules. So as if there was not so much an actual regulatory constraint, but more a reputational, implicit, self-imposed constraint that was holding back financial markets' interest in this sector. And this is actually very visible when we look at one particular type of funding, which is that for companies that are involved in the production of nuclear weapons. Unfortunately, we live in a geopolitical situation where this kind of discussions, as very, very well shown by both the speakers before me, are becoming very topical again. And so this is a crucial part of the story. So looking specifically at nuclear weapon is important in the context of sustainable finance because it's an area that has always been a little bit gray. So it is understood not to be part of the prohibited weapons lists, but at the same time, it does have a very strong reputational drag attached to it. And the result of this, that you can see in the chart on this slide, is that the financial industry has been very conservative in defining controversial weapons up until this point. And oftentimes, even though nuclear weapons are technically not prohibited, they were included in the definition of controversial weapons and therefore excluded. This is obviously more relevant for funds that were presenting themselves as being sustainable investment funds or funds that integrate some sustainability considerations. So in the European financial jargon, we call them Article 9 and Article 8 funds. You might have heard dark green and light green before. That is just a classification of investment products depending on how deep is the integration of sustainability considerations into the way that they manage their investment process. But for even for funds that are not dedicated to sustainable investments, so the Article 8 funds, about 16% of all those funds out there do have a complete prohibition, zero tolerance for any kind of nuclear weapon related investment. So no investment in any company that is exposed to this activity, which is quite strict. This is something that comes from underlying regulatory uncertainty. So the position of the European Commission that has been restated more recently in December in the EU Defense Omnibus that was published is that actually there is no regulatory constraint. So what the Commission says is, well, EU sustainable finance rules do not really place any regulatory restrictions on defense investment. There are some constraints, but these are very specific for very specific types of product. For example, the EU Paris-aligned benchmarks and the climate transition benchmarks, they do have some restrictions that are weapon-related. So there are some restrictions for these particular products in investing in companies that have exposures to controversial weapons. Also, more recently, ESMA put out guidelines that are supposed to apply to funds, investment funds that have sustainability-related terms in their name, so sustainable something or transition something. And that sort of like builds over the benchmark regulations. So it does introduce some limited restrictions to what those funds can do in terms of defense investment. But overall, those restrictions are all limited to what we call controversial weapons, except there has been, at least in the industry, so despite this being the official view, the view from the other side, so the view from the market has been that this is not as clear as it seems, at least, or as it's stated. Because as you can see here, from when we look at surveys of investors that are produced by market participants, actually, the majority of them do not think that it's clear. So there is very little agreement regarding the Commission's view that the sustainable finance framework indeed doesn't impose any limitations on defense investment, which is part of the reason the European Commission has come out with clarifications on the subject very recently. So this was a process that started in the summer of last year, and then it's been proceeding into and carried over into the Defense Omnibus that was published in December. And it is quite interesting to see, because in that in this notice that the Commission published as part of the Defense Omnibus, it is like specifically focused on whether we can think of defense investment as a sustainable investment. And it is actually, it goes actually a long way. So it goes all the way to define a framework for classifying investment in defense as a sustainable investment, which sort of like is based off the more general sustainable investment test that is already present in the EU Sustainable Finance Framework, but the Commission specifically sort of tailors this test for the specific defense sector. So it defines a framework where effectively sustainability is based on two different tests. There is a first test which requires an assessment of whether the investment contributes to a sustainability objective. And here the Commission says basically this could be potentially assessed by reference to the UN SDG number 16, so peace, justice, strong institution, by framing investment in defense as an investment that enables somehow the resilience and the security of the Union. And then the second step, which is the one that most people were basing their reputational constraints and concerns on, is that of demonstrating this investment does not harm any sustainability objectives. And when we speak about lethal weapons, that's a high bar to demonstrate that there is no significant harm. But even on this point, the Commission offers a view on this that effectively goes in the direction of saying, yes, of course, this is an investment that potentially can have very adverse impacts, but they can be mitigated if certain conditions are present, particularly if the companies do not produce prohibited weapons, and at the same time, they do comply with EU and national export control legislations and have policies and due diligences in place that are effectively keeping a check on the transfer of technologies and the way that the technology works. So it was quite interesting to see, because I thought this, for many people in the market dealing with these things, it felt like a very significant shift in the narrative, at least from an official standpoint, on whether we can think of defense as fitting within the EU sustainable finance framework. So this has indeed set off a change in sentiment. So we have seen that happen over 2025. There had been a little bit of it before, some early movers after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Obviously, already this topic started to become very discussed, but there's been a very significant acceleration in 2025, which I think was driven on one end from different geopolitical concerns. So most notably after the infamous Oval Office meeting between President Zelensky, President Trump, that sort of like acted as a wake-up call, I think, on the Europeans. And then specifically in the market, this commission position that noticed that that laid out this position was, I think, an important catalyst for this change of sentiment. So when we look at investor service, it's increasingly pointing towards a larger and larger share of asset managers saying that they are interested in reviewing their approach to investing in the defense sector. The change between 2024 and 2025 alone is quite big. So 36% more firms that are interviewed in this survey say that they are considering changes to their framework. And the drivers of this that firms mention are predominantly the demand from the final clients. So final investors, retail investor clients are apparently becoming more and more interested in investing in the European defense space, and therefore trying to drive this conversation with the firms. And then the second largest is ideological shifts. So obviously this again highlights the importance of the geopolitical environment as an underlying driver for what we're seeing right now. This has led to actually a very strong performance of the European defense companies. What you have here is the 12 months forward price earnings ratio of 3 different indexes. So one is the Euro Stocks, which is basically the aggregate of the European market across all sectors that you can think of. The red one is something that has been very fashionable for very long now, which is IT, technology, information technology. So this is the topic of the moment. And then the blue one is European defense. So what you can see here is that European defense, in terms of valuations, is actually reached the levels of companies that are in the information technology sector. So the most booming part of the market. There's been a very, very fast increase in valuations for European defense companies. As you can see, starts exactly around the time of that Oval Office meeting that I was mentioning, so early in the spring. And then there's been a further acceleration that you can see at the towards the end of the chart on the right now, so in the past few days. And I think that's it's clear to everyone that that's the Greenland discussion sort of acting as a further catalyst for the interest in these companies. Demand for European defense-focused investment products have been very strong in 2025. Now the European market has, I think, 7 defense ETFs, exchange-traded funds, which are very accessible retail investment products. And 6 of these have actually been launched after March 2025, again, stressing how sensitive this whole dynamics has been to the ongoing geopolitical dynamics. And when we look at all the inflows in thematic ETFs from the beginning of 2025, so for the whole year of 2025, basically, the almost half of all those inflows in all those thematic ETFs was defense. So definitely defense has been the investment topic for European ETFs in 2025. Okay. This has been reflected in slightly growing share of defense investment across the European fund market, so exposure to defense companies within investment funds. And this is something that has been increasing since 2022, actually. So since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, exposure to aerospace and defense stocks has generally been growing, but it's been growing quite slowly. And also it's been growing from a very, very, very low starting point. So it still remains quite low today. On average, we're talking 2.5% exposure for the actively managed investment funds in Europe, and 1.2 for the passive funds. So it's still pretty small, meaning there's potentially a lot more room for this to grow. And there's actually estimates around of how much capital could be moving towards the defense sector if all those Article 8 light green, as I mentioned earlier, investment funds were to increase their exposure to the average level across this investment vehicle category, and that's it is a potentially quite a striking pool of capital that could be redirected towards the defense sector if this was to happen. But what we're seeing in the data is this seems to be a relatively slow process so far. So we'll see whether, with the regulatory clarifications that came in 2025, this potentially accelerates, but so far it's been relatively contained. So the last thing I wanted to say, because I think I'm also been overrunning my time, is perhaps just a couple of implications from all the things that I showed so far and said so far for the way that we think about defense and the way that we think about sustainable finance in Europe. Because obviously the big question behind this is, yes, all very good, but like it doesn't make sense to try and frame defense as if it was a sustainable investment. Is it sustainable investment? How we define that? I think and this is actually I'm quite happy with the quote that you selected for me, because as you can see on the slide, I selected it myself as my first conclusion, my first implication. So it is true, a move towards an idea of sustainable defense investing will be a challenge for the way that traditionally we have been doing sustainable investing, the approaches that traditionally have been used, because those are typically based on looking at a company, looking at what share of the company revenues comes from certain activities that are perceived to be controversial, and effectively applying blanket exclusions based on that. So on whether that share is above or below a certain threshold, and that is also how the approach to the defense sector has been up until now. The Commission guidance was quite clear that they see this blanket approach as inconsistent with the European Union's strategic needs and priorities, and that we should be moving towards a case-by-case assessment. Which I think is a very good suggestion, but from an operational standpoint, it does present difficulties and challenges, because it will require different data than most of the market currently uses to evaluate the sustainability of investment, particularly when it comes to defense companies. It will require a lot more granularity on the geographical and product segmentation of what they do, a lot more data and transparency and due diligence on policies, processes that are in place, and implementation of those. And so it will obviously require also a much more hands-on / active approach on the side of investors, not just passively including or excluding sectors, but like actively looking case by case and also engaging potentially more with the investee companies. So finally, financial market participants, if they want to sort of follow this new way, this new approach to the investing in the defense sector, they must be prepared to, in my view at least, to embrace a much greater accountability that will come from the flexibility that now, from a regulatory standpoint, it seems to be a lot more clearly embedded in the system. So I think I'll stop here because I overran my time for sure, but I'm happy to answer any questions if anyone has them on the panel or in the room.
Thank you, Silvia, very much. We saw from your presentation that indeed ESG and defense investment are kind of trade-off categories, at least as the market perceive it. And probably there is some reason for this, and which is impossible to change. I mean, it's impossible to square the circle in a sense, and to make defense investment more sustainable. There are some limits, of course, to it, and I think we see this now. Luckily, we have now Florian Krampe with us, and he just arrived now with the cab and with the flight from Stockholm here in Vienna. But before giving you the floor, I promised Guntram to give the first round of questions specifically to his presentation, just because he has to leave us earlier. If this is still true, Guntram, should we just collect some few questions on your presentation, which was very much defense and economy oriented, but nevertheless, of course, you might also ask whether this, how we would frame it in our more general topic of sustainable security. Who wants to ask a question? One here at the panel, somebody else? Because otherwise, me too, I would have a question.
I have a question if no one has one.
Huh? You would also have one, yeah? Okay. Yeah. Okay, so let's start with Mr. Fang, yeah.
So thank you for the opportunity. A very simple question. What do you see as the biggest obstacle in order to establish a common European defense market?
Silvia, what's your question?
It was going a little bit in the same direction, to be honest, because I was really struck by the chart that you showed on procurement. So SMEs versus like large caps. And this is also something that obviously in the financial market, we see there's like the big players, but there isn't much else in the European space. So I was wondering whether you could elaborate a little bit more on what makes the US market different in that respect and like so strikingly different from the European market.
Okay, and me personally, I would have, first of all, a more general question. That is, if you think of the overall expenditures planned for defense being now moving towards some 5% of GDP, or let's see, some including dual use, it's perhaps a bit less, 3.5 or so. And compare this with all these debates we had during the last couple of years on whether we are capable or willing to spend about at least 2% of GDP for climate issues, and how difficult this was, even including that most of this investment would come from the private sector. So how do you square this circle? And the other aspect is, because you insisted that the multiplier for defense investment is quite substantial. If you compare it with the multiplier on climate investment, on clean tech investment, on clean energy investment, and so on, how does it compare in your view?
Right. So thank you so much for the great 4 questions. I mean, okay. I mean, the first one is the most difficult one, of course, and it's because it's a very political question at the end of the day. I mean, I think the extent to which we will integrate our defense markets has a lot to do with the military level and the political trust level that we have between our countries. Now, on the trust level, what can I say? On the military level, I would say there is certainly collaboration happening, but our mindset so far has been a mindset that essentially the collaboration that we do, the military collaboration that we do, is all organized and done through NATO, of course. And the binding glue of NATO is the United States, right? And that means that basically the way we accordingly also organized our defense markets was that they are very much national defense markets. So Germany buys in Germany, the UK buys in the UK, Poland buys in Poland to the extent they can, and Italy buys in Italy, of course. And then if one buys outside of your own country, well, one tends to go to the US, or in the Polish case, to South Korea also. So my sense is that to the extent that we have to rethink our collaboration, military collaboration, political collaboration with the US, we will have to reflect on the structure of the defense markets as well. So those two things basically will be correlated at some level, and I think that's an opportunity, but it's of course a big challenge. And I think in particular, people coming originally from the military scene of NATO countries, they find it extremely difficult because at the military level, their day-to-day operation is all NATO, right? And it's all, and you trust your counterparts, your military counterparts in the US, and rightly so, because you worked with them for 50, 60, 70 years and very effectively. But unfortunately, we live in a time where sort of this technical top-end technical level perhaps matters somewhat less than it used to. And so in that sense, I think there's a lot of stress, and there's certainly a political question here that is emerging. Sylvia, on your question of the SMEs, I mean, absolutely. So you will see very soon a draft that I will circulate in the Bruegel chat in which we are both. But I mean, I think the basic story is that the United States has done a number of reforms that explicitly aim to include SMEs in the procurement process. For example, there is a reform that was done which sort of encourages the procurement agencies to do multi-award contracting. So framework contracts where you don't just have one supplier for a certain good, but you have basically 2 or 3 different ones. And then as you go on, you tend to give more to sort of not just the one big one, let's say Lockheed Martin, but you also give to, at the time it was actually Anduril, right, which was a small company at the beginning, and got into this procurement stack thanks to basically some of these policies in which they used in the early years of their existence. And so I think we just have to learn from that. Now, then, do we have to go perhaps in the direction of Ukraine, which is a completely revolutionized procurement process, where significant parts of the procurement actually operate almost like an online marketplace, like, I mean, I'm always saying like almost like Amazon. Well, I mean, I think that's perhaps something we at least need to study carefully, right? And I think it's very difficult for the military people and for the existing procurement agencies to really think in those terms. But actually, I'm quite convinced that the speed of innovation and the speed of change in that space is actually accelerating a lot. And our processes, which are very bureaucratic driven, very sort of long, many years, platform driven, will have to change, or we will basically be outdated. Okay, so then on the climate point, well, I mean, so I guess the one interpretation is to say that politicians can, at some level, more easily sort of secure resources when their national security is at stake compared to when they want to contribute to a global public good, which is climate change, right? So there's a difference here, and I think it's a political difference. The second point I would like to make is, I mean, the 3.5% is a goal that I think north and east of Europe will achieve, and the center of Europe. I don't think the South and the West will achieve it anytime soon. So there will be significant differences based on the fiscal space. So countries that are fiscally more constrained will find it much more difficult to do this. While essentially the countries where the proximity to Moscow is actually very high, but also the fiscal space is actually relatively good. I mean, those countries will invest. And so I think in terms of, perhaps that's also an answer to the first question, in terms of the collaboration that will emerge, I do think the northern and eastern, central eastern, northern bloc will more closely collaborate on these issues also because they have the resources. And yeah, in terms of the multiplier, to be honest, I don't have a very good estimate now in my head for the multiplier for green tech. But obviously, I mean, the key is when you innovate and when you do this this kind of R&D. I mean, there is the specific one for the military purpose itself, and the question is it generalizable? So can it be made general so that it has more the type of a general purpose technology? And I mean, that could also happen in the climate space. So but I don't have a good study in my head now on this. So let me pass on that question. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I really enjoyed being here, and thank you for the great questions.
Okay, thank you, Guntram. And now, Florian, the floor would be yours if you want to present here, yeah, or even to speak without presentation, as I know. So thank you for managing to come here, almost just in time.
Almost just in time.
The time is now yours.
No, thank you very much for having me, and thank you for your patience and flexibility, especially, Governor, really great to see you, and thank you all for coming and having me. Well, I almost wish I had a climate story for the delay, but it was a technical issue, and better safe than sorry. And maybe that is an interesting segue, because picking up where Guntram maybe left off, we are witnessing the largest reallocation of public capital in Europe since the end of the Cold War. And in the face of aggression, we are rebuilding our defenses. And from a traditional security perspective, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, let's not be kidding us. I don't know if you followed, Trump was talking in Davos a couple of hours ago. That story, at the same time, we are seeing the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has sparked a lot of the defense reallocations and investments. We're seeing threats against European countries. We're seeing incursions into European airspace, as well as hybrid attacks. So let's be real. The threats are real. The security issues are there. But from a strategic and societal economic perspective, I would argue, I'm not an economist, but I would still argue from an economic perspective, I would argue that we're making a fundamental error, because we treat defense and climate as competing line items. And I think that is where we must change our approach. We assume that at the moment the security threat of Russia and the security threat to Europe is so severe that climate change doesn't matter. Now, as I said, the threat is real, but at the same time, I'm a researcher in the Climate Change and Risk Program at CIPRI in Stockholm. I've been studying climate change and environmental security issues for the last 17 years. The security implications of climate change are also real. So my argument today is very simple, that we don't have the luxury to wait to first have a separation where we first focus on the defense side and then we focus on the climate side. I would argue that is strategic fiction. Because in the 21st century, a defense strategy cannot be built on the assumptions of the 20th century. Ignoring climate change means we are not building security, and the research is backing that up. Instead, what we're doing with this investment, if we're ignoring climate change, is we're creating stranded assets, we're building a fortress on quicksand, and in the end, what we are actually doing by our attempts to invest to making us more secure is actually we're leaving societies less secure. So as I said, the security reality in the age of climate change is actually about wider security implications, right? It's not just about the military threats, but it's much wider. But it also, and that is a factor that me and my team, we're working primarily in the context of fragile conflict-affected states. We see that everywhere, right? We see that in those countries, how climate change is compounding the hardship and insecurity of people. But it is also about European security and European defense capabilities, because climate change is changing the security landscape. And the key examples here, maybe just to go through a few from the research side, we can start looking at the Arctic, very popular with Greenland at the moment. But aside from that question, we see how melting permafrost is actually destabilizing critical infrastructure, like the runways as well as early warning radar stations, that our early warning, obviously, in the Arctic is dependent on. But just to add a nuclear dimension to that, it's also what our nuclear deterrence and nuclear warning systems are related to. So it's no surprise that the Biden administration in 2024, in its defense budget request, proposed $5.1 billion in funding for, quote, enhancing combat capabilities and mitigating climate risks. So it's about the Arctic, but it's not just about the Arctic. It's about getting the military ready for a changing 20th century world. We see the other impacts that melting glaciers, especially in the Arctic, but overall that the changing salinity through that, because that is fresh water, is actually changing the sonar read capabilities of submarines and of detecting of submarines. So it has a direct implication on anti-submarine warfare. I'm also not a nuclear security expert, but I think if there's one domain where we do not want uncertainty, it's probably in the nuclear security field. The other examples we can relate more in the area of heat. We see that aircraft have a difficulty of taking off. The lift of aircraft, their capacity to lift off, is inhibited by extreme heat. It impacts equipment durability. We have problems that some of the ships, actually of the US, are not able to cool nuclear reactors that are propelling them to the same degree because the temperatures of the water are too hot in some of the regions in the Gulf. And we see also how the extreme heat is actually impacting soldiers very directly, impacting training schedules, impacting their ability to perform because of the changing and more frequent and more severe environment. And that is also a factor that we experience probably from the civilian side a few times in our interactions with the military in the face of natural disasters. Look at the floods in Spain and Poland in 2024, where tens of thousands of troops were diverted from defense readiness to disaster relief. We have seen similar examples and similar deployments in Germany. We have seen it last year in Switzerland, and I'm pretty confident, without knowing the details, that we are also seeing this in Austria. It's a constant reality. The problem is that when a fighter jet cannot take off because the runway is broken, because permafrost melted the infrastructure or destroyed the infrastructure, it's not an environmental issue. It's also an environmental issue, but it's a loss of defense capability. When a radar system isn't able to, is collapsing and breaking down, it is a security failure, right? So that is just to illustrate that these are, climate change is not just about climate. It's actually having a direct impact already today on military capabilities. And that, I think, is where we see the biggest disconnect. And despite these physical realities, our financial planning is quite incoherent. A recent paper by the European Central Bank suggested that Europe needs to mobilize an additional investment ranging from 2.7 to 3.7% of European GDP each year until 2030 to effectively achieve the green transition. So take that as a counterpoint to the 5% target for NATO, or the 3.5% GDP explicitly on defense, and the 1.5% within there on wider security and resilience building measures. As was pointed out, for defense, it seems the political will is there and the money is there. Meanwhile, we struggle to mobilize the resources for the green transition, even though we see that climate change is actually undermining our security and our defense capabilities in the long run. As I said, I'm not an economist, but to me that sounds like a flawed hedging strategy. So one of the questions of the discussion and, on the announcement was, is climate policy peace policy? And for me, working at a peace research institute, looking at climate change and security issues, the answer is absolutely yes. But only if we are considering climate resilience as a prerequisite for defense capabilities and defense efficacy, if we have integrated security, where national security, societal security, and ecological security are all taken into account. That's why we need to change our investments, and I think that was also already touched upon now, the look at dual use or dual capabilities and the investments, which would be one of my pleas, that we start looking more into that area where we must direct defense spending towards innovation and technologies that serve both security and climate goals. Examples are decentralized renewable energy grids that make military bases more resilient, harder to knock out. We see that in the case of Ukraine, but also more broadly in deployment in peacekeeping. But of course, decentralized microgrids, battery storage, all of that has civilian application that is relevant in so many other cases, and it provides a real security dividend. And we see another example where Spain is actually already doing this, where the Spanish government has earmarked 1.75 billion of its growing military budget in line with the NATO discussions on climate-responsive dual-use capabilities that explicitly are designed to tackle climate-related emergencies. I think that is smart capital allocation. The other part is we need political harmonization. In Sweden, the government has recently blocked 13 wind power farms in the Baltic Sea because they interfered with radar and air defense capabilities. Now, in this case, that was actually true, and that is actually a real issue that was needed to be taken into account. But of course, we solved one security issue by not solving another one. Even though if we start thinking about these things together, we see that innovation in the space is actually possible, and other countries are already doing that, which actually enhances our air defense capabilities if we build and think those things together. The last point here is the geopolitical reality, and this is maybe where things get a little bit cynical, because if we are honest about it, the current threat landscape and actors like Russia are actively undermining the green transition in Europe through disinformation. Quote, NATO report last year. So why is it doing it? Because fossil fuel dependency makes Europe more vulnerable. So every day we delay the transition is a day we remain strategically exposed. And so green energy is not just about carbon emissions, it's about autonomy, it's about our security. So in conclusion, in a world increasingly shaped by climate change, the enemy is not just a state actor. Climate change is an actorless threat. And it's an enemy that is destabilizing our planetary system and that our societies and our economies actually depend upon. If the narrative remains, first we secure our defense capabilities, then we save the planet, we will fail with both. And from an investment strategy, I would say that would mean that we can't accept defense strategies that lack climate resilience in their strategies. They are one and the same thing. And if your defense investment isn't climate-proofed, it's a bad investment. If your climate investment doesn't account for security, it's naive. Thank you.
Thank you, Florian, because indeed, I think it was even an advantage that you spoke as the latest speaker now in this round here, because you managed in a sense to close this circle of debate and really bringing things together. But it's, yeah, but of course, still, I'm sure there is a lot of questions that are in the room, not only questions, perhaps even controversial opinions. Everything is, of course, allowed to say here as long as we remain friendly. But I would invite you now to come up with questions and short comments. And I think we also have questions in the online questions. And yeah, I would first of all perhaps ask if with one question, how many are? It's just one, yeah. Okay, Teresa, please tell us.
So I have an online question for Sylvia. Could you please give your assessment to potential contributions of public dual-use investments, for example, railway infrastructure, resilient power supply, etc., to the sustainability objective on EU level? How is the state of discussion on EU level about public dual-use investments as a part of EU's future defense funding?
Thank you very much for introducing this very important... Okay, sorry.
Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry.
No, start. But I just want to mention that this term is important.
Yes, exactly. I just want to say I very much agree with what's just said, so that it is extremely important to open this discussion on dual use. I agree with that. I think from a strictly, let's say, financial market, sustainable finance perspective, it is something that I would believe to be less controversial compared to other types of defense-related funding. From a sustainable finance perspective, so within the EU sustainable finance framework. I think one move that definitely will help in that respect is the European Investment Bank decision recently to remove the requirement they had. So the EIB used to have a requirement for dual-use investment that the technology, or anyway the company that received the investment, it needed to have at least 50% of their revenues from civilian application to qualify for the financing. And this has been removed, which I think it has a good signaling effect on the broader market. And also the EIB has explicitly broadened the range of what qualifies as dual use when it comes to defense-related spending. So now including also areas such as military mobility, that very much was mentioned in the question, border protection, cybersecurity, and so on and so forth. So I think definitely on this, I think this is a move in the right direction. And it should help ease the discussion as well at the European level on this.
So thank you very much. Dual use, of course, an important element that tries at least to combine these two issues. I see a question here in the room. Anybody else?
Much, Mr. Breitenfelder. My name is Günther Fellinger from the Austrian Committee for NATO Enlargement. My question is about Eurobonds. When we simultaneously have this defense investment challenge and also the challenge, of course, of Ukraine's victory, reconstruction, and additionally, as Mr. Krampe said, we don't want to postpone the climate change challenge. We somehow have either to reduce welfare spending at the moment, which probably is not very popular in Austria and in the European Union, or we have to somehow finance that longer term. And obviously, it would be much better to finance that together as European Union. We had now a small breakthrough with the 90 billion Ukraine funding, and we have this role model of COVID funding, which we had 750. And so we have these systems now established. Where is now the political will, and maybe for general discussion to really fund these big challenges together, to say yes to Eurobonds and to make a big and major issue of probably €1 trillion, which is needed to manage and to fund the transition in the climate, the reconstruction of Ukraine, the victory and the rearmament on a joint basis, and to also not to have it at the budget effect immediately, but over the next 20, 30 years, as is the normal way how a war is funded in history ever. And we need to have the courage to tell this and to do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Of course, basically an opinion, but also raising a lot of colory questions. I think there was a question here, and then in the last row. Yeah.
Thank you. Martin Bruckner, Vienna University of Economics and Business. The AMOC is slowing down by 5% per decade and is expected to continue so. There's also a chance of an abrupt collapse of the AMOC. So I assume this is a major security threat for Europe. Is Europe preparing?
So the AMOC, I think, is the Atlantic movement of currents, and which helps indeed Europe to have a kind of mild climate. Otherwise, it would be much colder because Europe is more or less at a similar height of Canada. So we would have rather Canada climate without the Atlantic current. I think that's what you meant. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Another question for Silvia. The Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation was born and got into force in so-called peace times some years ago. Do you see the need to completely rewrite or rework this regulation in the light of the days we see today? A complete rethinking of this whole regulation in the sense of make it easier to invest in defense industry, in dual as we heard first, in dual use of industries. In the market, you hear a lot of voices saying that the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation is completely outdated and needs a complete reform.
Okay, so we have now collected 3 questions. I mean, Silvia, you have been mentioned basically as one of us to answer it, but of course feel free to also jump in and to give your perspective on the question. Silvia, you first.
Yes, I'm actually going to start from the last question, which is a very good question. And also, I see there's one in the chat that is related. So it's also regulatory side. And the one on the chat, I'm going to read it, says, EU banks' internal rules for ESG are very much driven by the EU taxonomy. Are there changes on the way for incorporating defense and peacekeeping into the taxonomy? And those are two excellent questions, I think. So on the SFDR does not really say what investors can or cannot invest in. It sets out disclosure requirements. So it says that you basically do what you want to do. You invest in whatever you want to invest, but then you have some requirements around the disclosure of sustainability content of that investment. So I think per se, it is not a big factor in explaining why there's been no defense, not enough defense investment. And I think maybe we don't need necessarily, for this particular reason, we don't need to rewrite the SFDR, but for example, the position that the Commission put out, which was very clear, can serve as a guideline for investors on how to interpret the SFDR requirements. I then think the SFDR has a lot of things that don't work, but not strictly about defense. So we can have a different talk about that. And also there's actually a revision of the SFDR that has now been proposed by the European Commission. So by 2027, probably it will be very different than what it is today. Happy to talk about that in a different occasions if anyone's interested. On the taxonomy, that matters for banks because banks are required to calculate a metric which is called the green asset ratio, which is basically the ratio of their taxonomy aligned active assets over the total of their assets. And in the taxonomy, the questions around defense comes into play because taxonomy alignment also requires an assessment of what the regulation calls is minimum social safeguards, I think it's the term. And so basically, there's been a debate around whether investing in weapons producers, for example, does meet minimum social safeguards. Now, this is also going to be part of revision in the omnibus because the entire omnibus also includes some revisions around the way that the taxonomy is to be applied. So that will also be sort of part of this discussion, but that is mostly where it comes into play. So I would expect if there is a way to demonstrate that the activities being performed meeting minimum social safeguards, that should make it at least taxonomy eligible, then depending on what it is, potentially also taxonomy aligned. I want to say one super quick thing on Eurobonds, because I did write a piece on the 11th of April, which was like 5 days after Liberation Day, saying that this is exactly what the EU should be doing, not just, because at least I like Eurobonds and I see other people in the rooms like Eurobonds as well, but because it's actually a very, so the way that the US is renegotiating its relationship with the world, so to speak, offers Europe a great opportunity to provide an alternative safe asset. And there is also an opportunity to produce that safe asset by funding a European public good, which is genuinely a European public good, which is European defense. So to me, it was a no-brainer. I will say just that. Obviously, different people will have different opinion on this.
So thank you very much. So both climate and defense or security are public goods. Florian, do you have an opinion on this?
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I think, I'm not an expert on Eurobonds, but sounds like a really, really brilliant idea. And I think the key part here is simply if we don't, we're going to fail. Like if we don't start to finding the synergies and addressing those things together, and I would say welfare needs to be part of that, because otherwise we see all the grievances that are going to come up and that are going to be exploited in our democracies, that are creating a whole other threat again, right? And make us again vulnerable to hybrid attacks from other actors. So we need to capture all of those things together. We need to fight the, and maybe we're getting into a conflict there, but the taxonomy, I mean, that's good. But of course, from a societal perspective, like, right, some things are hard to just put in one category. Like it is in multiple categories by design. And we often, I see that specifically on the climate investment in fragile states, right? Where it's like, well, that can only be climate adaptation. That cannot be development aid. And that cannot be peace building funding. And you're like, how is that in the case of Somalia not, right? I mean, those things need to go together. On the AMOC, I think, is Europe preparing? The interesting, I mean, if I want to be snarky, I'm like, for what? Right? It's like for collapse. That means, okay, we're entering a new ice age. That's going to be one side of investment. Or maybe that's not going to happen, and it's just a slowdown, and it's going to take really long. It's like, so that's a whole different set of investment, because that's a warming Europe, and probably soon in Uppsala I'm gonna be able to plant wine nicely and export it. But so what are you, from a military perspective, preparing for? Like for new icebreakers because we're entering the ice age, or for heat adaptation because, well, it's going to be really hot and we're seeing more wildfires, etc. I think it's taken into account by some military planning units. I know we've worked with the Swedish Defense forces on some of that. I know there's some discussions going on, but are we planning for it? I don't think so.
Not in Europe. Not in Europe, but I know from the American side they are doing that. They are doing research on that. What is the impact on the military itself? What is changing, and what do they have to do in the future related to climate change? What comes in addition?
Okay, so we have a very last round of questions, even if I've already beyond our time schedule. But I hope you understand we started a bit late and so on, so that we can have a last round of questions. Yeah, Thomas, then Anna, and I think we have also, okay, and yeah.
Yeah, Tomas Lachika, I'm from the economics department in this house. To play a little bit the devil's advocate here, I have a question for Mr. Feichtinger and Kampe. You made the explicit link, and in case of Mr. Feichtinger, also a very striking link between security and climate. But what you did not mention at all, and I've been missing it a lot, is the role of economic growth or welfare in a broader sense. Where would you see the role of economic growth in relation to security and climate? In particular, would you agree that these three topics might not necessarily be complementary goals, but conflicting goals? So there might be a trinity, basically, for us, and that economic growth is the utmost, the most important priority for us should be, so that we should ensure that people in Bangladesh or Sudan that you mentioned should, in the first place, grow richer, because when they grow richer, they will be also in a better position to deal with all the climate and security issues that they will be increasingly facing. Thank you.
Okay.
By the way, this holds true also for Europe, right? So it's not only a trinity issue in developing countries, but also in developed countries.
Yeah, by the way, growth has already been mentioned a couple of times here in this round. And of course, the questions on multipliers was also intended to ask on the fiscal potential of fiscal policy to, via climate or defense investment, to also increase growth, basically. And by the way, Guntram said he does not know studies. I would tend to believe that climate investment has a at least slightly higher multiplier effect, but this may be debatable. Still some two questions.
Yeah, thank you, Florian Kramper, for raising this important point of synergies, considering the renewable energy system. Now, the renewable energy system increases the need for critical raw materials. At the same time, also weapons production needs a lot of critical raw materials. And the EU Critical Raw Materials Act was firstly mostly directed towards the energy transition. Now there's also talk of weapons production. And there's talk of just transition and fairness and equity in the trade relations regarding critical raw materials, and that might also be a security issue. Yeah, so I would be interested in what the panels have to say about that.
Okay, final question, Thomas Reininger.
So it's more a comment. I'm Thomas Reininger from the Austrian Central Bank here. It's more a comment referring to the question Mr. Feichtinger has put forward on the defense single market you asked to Guntram Wolf. I would like to make you aware of the fact that the European Commission is planning a communication on the defense single market, and currently is conducting a public consultation for 4 weeks, now running up to 6th of February. So to ask experts for comments what are their ideas, how to improve the defense single market. So it's about identifying the barriers and proposing actions, how to improve. So this might also be interesting for Sylvia, proposing, for instance, the Eurobond idea in that context. Thanks a lot.
Okay, taking this comment as the unfortunately last one we have to pick up, I would now invite you for a final round of comments, also giving a kind of summary of what your take is of our debate of today.
Coming straight to the point of economic growth, of course, it is a prerequisite for the countries in order to handle the problems that are increasing related to climate change. But the big challenge is most of the countries that are highest affected by climate change are poor countries. And they are not really, I would say, highly democratic countries. So it is a problem in itself, how you can achieve economic growth in order to be able to be prepared for managing the effects of the climate change, but by not being able to contribute to a political change in itself. I say it from the perspective as a conflict researcher for many years. And that was one of the biggest problems always. What can you do from outside in order to make a better situation for the population, for the economic growth, etc., if you do not have a good approach to the government in place? General remark, finally, I think we are really living in challenging times. And single approaches to complex problems will not be the best way. So if we have such a complexity and interdependencies, we have to find comprehensive solutions. And that is, for me, the biggest appeal and challenge to all people that deal with that, from the economy, from the science, from researchers, etc., how to develop a new approach in managing complexity in order to address that challenges.
Thank you. Florian, would you?
I mean, that was a really good final statement. I mean, I subscribe to that. I think, I mean, just briefly on the questions, economic growth, absolutely. Maybe I'm naive, but I would, how is innovation and being on the forefront of green technology, how is that not good for the economy? I would be surprised if it isn't, but there might be studies. And again, I'm not an economist. But just look at China and EVs and the market capacity and yeah, I think that is the case. Critical minerals, absolutely a security issue and really difficult. Remember, we're talking Greenland, but remember Ukraine, right? That was a thing like half a year ago or something with Trump. It's a really fundamental thing. It's a security issue. Some of the key minerals, we have the relation with China. That is one geopolitical security relationship. Then some of the minerals are, especially in cases like the Democratic Republic in Congo, that's not a place you can access, or as a European company, you would be able to get resources from, or you shouldn't. So it's a really difficult space, but it goes back to the synergies. Like, we need to come to a space and we need to facilitate investment that is de-risking some of those spaces, and that's actually an opportunity, right? I mean, I'm a peace researcher, so I'm the optimist, maybe, but it needs to be an opportunity, and that's maybe then also in closing is we can look at these challenges, and they are, as you said, they're complex, they're complicated, and there are no easy answers, but we can look at them as a dilemma we're not going to solve, as a security challenge that is inevitable, or we can take them as motivation, as an opportunity for cooperation, to come together and try to solve them. And I think that choice we should make, and then we have the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you very much. I don't know whether Governor Martin, you are happy with the results of our panel. I mean, at least we are exploiting the opportunities here in this house, having very frank talk on issues that are not necessarily related to our central bank issues, but of course we always need some perspectives in the very long term, and I think we helped to give this without being either, let's say, naive pacifists, nor cynical warmongers. I think we kept it within the realm. A central bank is the right place to discuss. Give please an applause now to all of our speakers. Thank you very much. And forgive us that we could not solve this dilemma. Yeah?
Yes, next year.